Jim, a 37-year-old schoolteacher, was a volunteer who didn't like to talk much about his experiences. During his tolerance study, we talked about going further through the bright colors, which he admitted were distracting him. He felt there might be beings behind the colors, and I encouraged him to see if there were. After emerging from his last dose, he said almost offhandedly and with little emotion, "I went with them as you suggested. There were clinical researchers probing into my mind. There were sort of long fiber optic things that they were putting into my pupils." This was years after we had stopped using the pupil measuring card, so it had nothing to do with what was happening in room 531. I asked Jim what that was like for him. It was pretty weird, but I figured it was just the drug. Jeremiah, at 50 years of age, was one of our oldest volunteers. He had recently retired from decades of service in the armed forces and was beginning a new phase of his professional life by obtaining training in clinical counseling. He was also starting his third family, and he underwent a facelift halfway through the dose-response study. He was a busy man. During the first few minutes of his non-blind high dose of DMT, Jeremiah burst out in several exclamations. "Whoa! Wow! Incredible!" He began beaming, a huge smile across his face. He seemed to be having a great time. It was a nursery, a high-tech nursery with a single Gumby, 3 feet tall, attending me. I felt like an infant, not a human infant, but an infant relative to the intelligences represented by the Gumby. It was aware of me, but not particularly concerned, sort of a detached concern, like a parent would feel looking into a playpen at his 1-year-old lying there. As I went into it, I heard a sound. Then I heard 2 to 3 male voices talking. I heard one of them say, "He's arrived." I felt evolution occurring. These intelligences are looking over us. There is hope beyond the mess we are making for ourselves. I couldn't change the experience at all. I couldn't have anticipated it or even imagined it. It was a total surprise. I tried to open to love, but that was silly. All I could do was observe it. I found this last comment especially interesting because it challenged my assumption that what Jeremiah encountered was a product of his mind, rather than a true perception. Opening to love is shorthand for an effort to change the anxiety caused by an unexpected or unpleasant experience into love. If what Jeremiah had just encountered was only a product of his own imagination, he may have been able to alter his reactions. The fact that his attempt felt silly reminded me of the futility of trying to open to love to an oncoming truck. Opening to love as he found himself instantly dropped into an alien nursery was such an ineffectual and inappropriate response that it seemed laughable. Several months later, Jeremiah received his double-blind 0.4 milligram per kilogram DMT dose. At 5 minutes, he began. That was much more intense than the first major dose. It's a different world, amazing instruments, machine-type things. There was one person operating some of this stuff. I was in a big room. He was in another part of it. I feel a little shaky, a little hypersensitive. There are little tremors going through my body. Maybe closing your eyes might help here. Let's put a blanket on you too. There was one big machine in the center with round conduits, almost writhing. Not like a snake, more like in a technical manner. The conduits were not open at the end. They were solid blue-gray tubes made of plastic. The machine felt as if it was rewiring me, reprogramming me. There was a human, as far as I could tell, standing at some type of console, taking readings or manipulating things. He was busy at work, on the job. I observed some of the results on that machine, maybe from my brain. It was a little frightening, almost unbearably intense. It all began with a whining, whirring sound. Jeremiah's last double-blind session was the less overwhelming but definitely psychedelic 0.2 milligram per kilogram dose. At this session, he was surrounded by the orthopedic traction cage, but he denied that it bothered him. Josette was filling in for Cindy that morning as our nurse. At 10 minutes, he began. There were 4 distinct beings looking down on me, like I was on an operating room table. I opened my eyes to see if it was you and Josette, but it wasn't. They had done something and were observing the results. They are vastly advanced scientifically and technologically. They were looking just over the traction bar in front of me. I guess they were saying, "Goodbye, don't be a stranger." Josette said that some of what Jeremiah described reminded her of some of her own weird dreams, and she went on to tell us about one of them. Jeremiah replied, "That was a dream you described. This is real. It's totally unexpected, quite constant and objective. One could interpret your looking at my pupils as being observed, and the tubes in my body as the tubes I'm seeing. But that is a metaphor, and this is not at all a metaphor. It's an independent, constant reality." Josette collected the last blood sample and left the room, closing the door behind her. Jeremiah and I relaxed quietly together. DMT has shown me the reality that there is infinite variation on reality. There is the real possibility of adjacent dimensions. It may not be so simple as that there's alien planets with their own societies. This is too proximal. It's not like some kind of drug. It's more like an experience of a new technology than a drug. You can choose to attend to this or not. It will continue to progress without you paying attention. You return not to where you left off, but to where things have gone since you left. It's not a hallucination, but an observation. When I'm there, I'm not intoxicated. I'm lucid and sober. Dimitri's sessions continue to fill out themes of testing and experimentation upon volunteers once the spirit molecule brought them into non-material realms. 26 years old when he started in the DMT research, Dimitri was of Greek extraction. He lived with Heather, whose experience of unseen worlds we read about in chapter 12. He was a writer and editor and was a seasoned and steady explorer of inner space. He had smoked DMT about 60 times and had taken LSD hundreds of times, ketamine 50 to 100 times, and MDMA about 30 times. When I arrived in his room, Dimitri was casual about the day's schedule. "I'm not too excited about this. I know it's just a low dose." "Wait until tomorrow," I replied. 10 minutes after I injected this low dose, Dimitri said, "It was pretty psychedelic, more so than I thought it would be." The next day, Dr. V and his assistant Mr. W joined us as guests. Dr. V worked for the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the agency funding my research. He was developing a project that might treat drug abusers with the African hallucinogen ibogaine. He wanted to see the effects of a powerful psychedelic drug given in a research setting. Mr. W had been one of the most helpful people during my search through the regulatory labyrinth for human-grade DMT. I was happy to share with him the results of his assistance. Dimitri's partner, Heather, was with us that day too. Add Dimitri, Laura, and me, and there were 6 in all. It was a crowd in room 531. Almost immediately after the injection was complete, Dimitri began breathing deeply and rapidly. He repeatedly sighed and yawned, as if to dispel physical tension. At about 9 minutes, he asked for some water and thanked us when we gave him a few sips. After wetting his mouth, he began. I feel like I'm in a mild state of shock. I feel really shaky. Here's a blanket. Okay. Don't forget to breathe. There's a lot of energy being released. I asked Laura to go out into the hall and turn off some beeping equipment outside. Dmitri wasn't quite sure what we were doing. He decided to ignore the fuss. The first thing I noticed was a burning in the back of my neck. Then there was this loud, intense hum. It was like the fan at first, but separate. It began engulfing me. I let go into it, and then, wham! I felt like I was in an alien laboratory in a hospital bed like this, but it was over there. A sort of landing bay, or recovery area. There were beings. I was trying to get a handle on what was going on. I was being carted around. It didn't look alien, but their sense of purpose was. It was a three-dimensional space. I expected cartoon-like creatures, like a commercial for LSD, but this was, oh my gosh, it was unlike any other DMT experience I've had. They had a space ready for me. They weren't as surprised as I was. It was incredibly unpsychedelic. I was able to pay attention to detail. There was one main creature, and he seemed to be behind it all, overseeing everything. The others were orderlies or disorderlies. They activated a sexual circuit, and I was flushed with an amazing orgasmic energy. A goofy chart popped up like an X-ray in a cartoon, and a yellow illumination indicated that the corresponding system or series of systems were fine. They were checking my instruments, testing things. When I was coming out, I couldn't help but think, aliens. I am so disappointed I didn't talk to them. I was confused and in awe. I knew that they were preparing me for something. Somehow we had a mission. They had things to show me, but they were waiting for me to acquaint myself with the environment and movement and language of this space. The atmosphere in the room was surreal. It was bursting with people and a very strange story. I hoped Dr. V and Mr. W were all right. I also wondered if I might lose my funding next week, or see it doubled. It was not like any UFO abduction I've heard about. These beings were friendly. I had a bond with one of them. It was about to say something to me, or me to it, but we couldn't quite connect. It was almost a sexual bond, but not sex-like intercourse, but a total body communication. I was filled with feelings of love for them. Their work definitely had something to do with my presence. Exactly what remains a mystery. Let's close this chapter with one of the most striking interventions performed on a volunteer by these otherworld beings. In Ben's experience, they not only tested and probed him, but also implanted something into his body. Ben was 29 years of age and had recently relocated from Seattle. He was a drifter, having held 30 jobs in just 10 years. He was an old friend of Chris, about whose entity contact encounter we just read. During one of his longest stints of employment, Ben had served as a military policeman for 2 years. Ben was an intense fellow, short-cropped, nearly shaven head, a muscular build, and a very direct manner. He actively sought novelty and change, so it's not surprising that in his written statement about why he wanted to participate in the New Mexico research, he replied, "I'm an explorer, and I expect this will be an interesting experience." As with Dmitri, Ben's non-blind, low-dose DMT session was relatively powerful. His high sensitivity to DMT warned us that the next day probably would be one of the biggest psychedelic experiences of his life. I told him to be ready. While a little nervous the next day, Ben was eager for his non-blind high dose to begin. I spent a little more time than usual getting him ready, advising him to try and take some big deep breaths as the DMT went in. You may take in a breath and have that be the last thing you remember. You may not even notice the out breath. That means you're there. Ben tried to breathe deeply as the drug was going in. Then his breathing settled down as he obviously fell under the influence of the drug. His heart beat visibly in his chest. At about 3 minutes, his neck showed some hives, something that had also happened to several other volunteers who had truly astonishing stories to tell us later. At 8 minutes, several total body spasms occurred, and he cleared his throat. It was time to try and ground him. We're going to put a blanket on you. Try to breathe into that tension if you can. He slowed his breathing and started calming down, a big smile on his face. He stayed silent for 36 minutes, longer than most of our volunteers, before I felt the urge to rouse him. It started with a sound. It was high-pitched like a tightly taut wire. There were 4 or 5 of them. They were on me fast. As crazy as this sounds, they looked like saguaro cactus, very Peruvian in color. They were flexible, fluid, geometrical cacti, not solid. They weren't benevolent, but they weren't non-benevolent. They probed, they really probed. They seemed to know time was limited. They wanted to know what I, this being who had shown up, was doing. I didn't answer. They knew. Once they decided I was okay, they went about their business. His eyes were open, glazed, staring at the ceiling. He seemed unable to grasp what he had just undergone. I know it sounds incredible to you, to us too, but it happens. Haltingly, as if he weren't really sure he wanted to tell us, I felt like something was inserted into my left forearm, right here, about 3 inches below this chain-link tattoo on my wrist. It was long. There were no reassurances with the probe, simply business. Laura asked, was there any fear? Maybe at the onset, at just having my ego brushed aside. When they were on me, there was a little bit more confusion than fear, kind of like, hey, what is this? And then there they were. There was no time for me to say, who the hell are you guys? Let me see some ID. There are surprising and remarkable consistencies among volunteers' reports of contact with non-material beings. Sound and vibration build until the scene almost explosively shifts to an alien realm. Volunteers find themselves on a bed or in a landing bay, research environment, or high-technology room. The highly intelligent beings of this other world are interested in the subject, seemingly ready for his or her arrival and wasting no time in getting to work. There might be one particular being clearly in charge, directing the others. Volunteers frequently comment about the emotional quality of the relationships, loving, caring, or professionally detached. Their business appeared to be testing, examining, probing, and even modifying the volunteer's mind and body. Sometimes testing came first, and after results were satisfactory, further interactions took place. They also communicated with the volunteers, attempting to convey information by gestures, telepathy, or visual imagery. The purpose of contact was uncertain, but several subjects felt a benevolent attempt on the being's part to improve us individually or as a race.